one of the songs talks about us being vessels for God, having God use us in the world for his purpose. And that is something we really do see in this book of Esther. If you want to turn there, we will read some from Esther. I'm just going to, like I say, reiterate the story, and we'll read some selected passages. This book is a very interesting book. That last song we talked about, singing the praises of God, this book doesn't say God one time in the entire book. It doesn't mention his name once. But if you're a Jew, you absolutely know that the providence of God is in there. And just like we sang in the song, that's what we look for in our life, is that God would use us somehow in whatever situation it may be, because our focus is on God, and that is my main point about all of this, is having our motivation right and having our focus on God. So the story of Esther takes place after the actual return of many of the Jews from captivity. When we look at, when we see the story of Mordecai in the story, he's some 4 generations into this exile. So some of them could have returned, but as for the case of Mordecai and Esther, they have not returned. They have, I'm assuming, either chosen to stay or for whatever reason, whatever God's providence was working here, they needed to stay so that God could use them. And, probably one of the main reasons why we don't see the name God come up in this story is because it is in another nation, likely it was written. And you just don't write about a bunch of other gods, but you can make the implications all day long, and that's what we see here. So in the story, we see King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, depending on your version. From all the rabbinical sites that I visited, they refer to Ahasuerus. In this version I'm reading from, it's Xerxes. And there's a lot of confusion and arguments about this whole book, but all those aside. The other person in this is Vashti, as far as the beginning of the book. She's in there for a very short time. Because she is deposed, she is gotten rid of, and because of that, we see Esther and Mordecai come into this story. Esther is pretty young, and again, I checked Jewish sites to see what the rabbis teach about it, to see if there's any insights I can find, and I found that a lot of the tradition says that she was anywhere from 40 to 80 years old, which I find hard to believe. I don't know why they would say that. Because the word itself that describes her says she was a girl. She was probably somewhere between 15, 14, 17. She was a young lady. She was very young, which brings the prominence of what she was called to do to the fore. And it shows us that if your focus is on God, that things can work out, and eventually always work out for God's good. The other guy in this story is Haman, and other advisors to the king. And when we read the story, I had a lot of issues. I have issues reading the Old Testament anyway. I mean, I know this is God's world, and this is, it's the culture of the day that is so unlike today's culture. And these guys are just really, I don't want to criticize them too much, because this is a long time ago, but they're pretty crude about the way they live their lives and about the way things happen in that time. And so there's this big contrast of these people that God is addressing in this book. We have the King Ahasuerus or Xerxes, and the way people look at the emperors of the day was they were appointed by gods. They were essentially equal to the gods. They did their bidding, but they weren't considered a god necessarily. They had a multiplicity of God, both good and evil, and every time a new king came along, God would change, and it was just confusing, I would say. And of course, because this is the king, he lives a very elite lifestyle. It's very opulent. He has a lot of riches. In chapter 1, it describes his empire reaching from India all the way to Ethiopia. If you look at that map, that's immense, even by today's standards, which is pretty amazing. Let's remember, this is because of God that nations are able to do what they do. Then we see the other two main characters, Esther, who is the servant, I call her the servant of Jehovah. She's this exile, like I say, she's about 4 generations into this exile. I call her a commoner, but I don't know how true that is. She's an orphan because her parents died. And her parents died, and Mordecai, her cousin, took her under his wing and became like her father. So I say she worked with her hands. I'm assuming this is it for her. She probably isn't fair-skinned and have the soft skin and all this stuff like the elites would have, because she was a worker. Now we know that Mordecai ends up at the gates of the king. And you don't just show up at the gates of the king. It might have been because by this time Esther was the queen, so maybe that's why he was allowed. But it almost seems like he already had some stature at that gate. That's an important place to be. Not everybody gets, look at Washington, D.C., they've got barricades up. And so it's much the same way when you protect your king in any way you can. So chapter 1, we get to chapter 1. I titled this Too Much, Too Far. And then these are the wise men. Being a little bit critical about the men who are advising the king. The king decides he's going to have this great party. 6 months of literally partying, just as much wine as there could be. He tells the people who are serving the wine, there's no limit, just whatever they want, give it to them. And it's just, we're just going to have fun. And he's showing off everything that he has in his land. All the riches, all the gold, all the drinking vessels that are all different. You didn't go to Walmart and get all the same drinking vessels. These are all specifically artisan made of gold and silver, and he's just this really, really rich guy. So I was going to read briefly from 7, starting at verse 7, verse 1. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one from the other. And the king instructed to serve each man as he wished. Verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. So this was a separate party after that 6-month thing, or maybe even during. But it's kind of separate from all of that. And these are like the elite of the elite. Okay? And there's the men having their party, the women having their party. Queen Vashti, on the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, 7 days of drinking, by the way, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, skip the names, 11, to bring to him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles. She was lovely to look at. But when the king's attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. So, now the name Vashti means the best. So, he's been drinking for about a week, and for her own namesake, he's like, I got the best wife. Maybe he was slurring his words by that. I'm trying to 7 days of drinking, right? She's the most beautiful woman ever. And I want you guys to see her. And he calls for her. And she's having her own little party thing. with the ladies, and they're all there to see this request probably, and she says, oh no, no, I'm not going to do that. And is probably, rightfully so, very insulted by this request. There's a lot of supposition as to what was being really requested. There was a lot of lewdness involved with this. But she refuses, and being in a culture of faith is probably the worst thing you could do as a queen. Because now the king has lost face. And he becomes enraged. And there is the beginning of what we see between peoples. People who have God, Jehovah God, who see their lives as being vessels for God's creation, being purposeful for God. And people whose gods are basically about them. Because that's what idolatry is all about. It's about me. We talked about that this morning in class. It's this me thing. Everything's about me. What about me? And here's the king. Why would she do this? Put him in a bad position, because now he's lost face. Verse 15, he asks his advisors, according to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? She has not obeyed the command of the king. So he asks his buddies. There are the wise guys, the wise people. And they basically tell him, look, king, man, dude, not only has she refused you, and this is a bad thing for you, she's like poisoned the whole nation. All of our wives are going to do this now. They're not going to want to obey us. So here's what you got to do. You got to get rid of her. Now, some people say that she was executed. I don't think she was. He says, you need to get rid of her. And make a law that says that all the wives are to obey their husbands. Because that's a smart thing to do. Make the law that says they have to do this. And again, this is the difference between people who look for God's guidance, where God says, be just, be compassionate, love. And people whose God is basically themselves, just other gods, whatever idol it might be. The idolatry of me, I guess. Okay, I'll just force myself. This is going to have to be this way now. So that's what they do. And of course, they were all pleased with it. They thought everything's great now. So in chapter 2, we find the king, and it says that he remembered Vashti, and that he remembered the law. And it's almost like, I don't know if he's feeling remorse, but he's remembering this. And then all of a sudden, it interjects these advisors coming to him again and saying, look, king, this is what you got to do. You got to go round up all the young ladies in the kingdom and bring them to the castle. I assume it's a castle. Let's just say it's a castle. Bring them to the castle. And then you can choose a wife from one of them. Great idea, right? So that's what they do. They go and they round up all of the young ladies of the land. And it says in verse 8 of chapter 2, when the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Verse 10, and that included Esther. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. This is where we actually find Mordecai as well. This is when Mordecai is introduced. These are God's people in this land. So she's brought into the harem. She does not reveal that she is a Jew, and that's an important note later. So it says in verse 12, before a young woman's turn came, and remember this is just a young lady, to go into the king, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatment. prescribed for women, 6 months of oil and myrrh, and 6 with perfume and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning, return to another part of the harem among the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and asked for her by name. So this was basically the verdict against these young women. They got to live in the king's palace, but if he didn't like them, they just kind of had to live there the rest of their life. And this is what this young lady, Esther, is facing. Now, it also states that Esther found favor with the leaders of these men who watched over the king's wives, because that's what God does for his people. When other people obviously see goodness in other people. So verse 15, it says, then the turn came for Esther. In 16, she came to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. This was about 4 years after Vashti was released. Verse 17. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts. So she made the king very, very happy. She's very, very beautiful, which is what he wanted. She's probably the best. He's not going to name her Vashti. If you tried that once already, it didn't work. But she is the best. And that's what you need when you're the king. And he's obviously thinking very carnally. But God will make that. He can make that work. And that's the thing about God. God can make that work. Somebody could be evil, but God will make it work for good, whether they like it or not. Now at the end of chapter 2, something interjects. This other guy comes in. His name's Haman. He is a trusted man of the king. And he's elevated to second in command. That's a big deal. Kind of like Moses was. He's elevated to second in command. And the king makes a law that when he walks through the gate, if you're there at the gate, doesn't matter who you are, except him, you have to bow to him. That's the law. And, of course, Mordecai doesn't bow to him. Now, this Haman guy, he's just like a lot of other people in the land. He doesn't know a lot about Jehovah God, obviously. He is pretty much like the king, carnal. Everything's about me. In fact, Haman really has a problem with the me syndrome. He has a really, really big problem with the me syndrome. And he is angered that Mordecai isn't bowing. And Mordecai keeps not bowing every time he goes through it. His buddies walk him and go, he's like, Mordecai, what are you doing? Why aren't you bowing? The king says you got to bow. He says, I don't bow because I'm a Jew. Which seems kind of, okay. I wonder if you get bowed to the king. I don't know. Out of respect. I don't know. There's some supposition that maybe Haman wore some sort of idol, so Mordecai would have none of it. I don't know if that was true or not. Which is a guess. Another thing to consider is that Haman is of the lineage of Amalek. And all the way back in Deuteronomy, we see God casting judgment against the Amalekites. That God tells his people, don't forget what they did to you on the way out of Egypt. And they're going to pay for it. And that's probably has something to do with it. And we see in the reading that when Haman learns that Mordecai is a Jew, it doesn't go well on him. He hates him even worse. So before we get to what Haman does there's this other little intrigue that happens before him in the last part of chapter 2 that plays a big role later, where Mordecai actually saves the life of the king. Now, we don't know that part. The rest won't make any sense. But he saves the life of the king. He reveals a plot against the king, and it's written down in the Chronicles, and then it kind of just goes away. So, Haman is so full of hatred, and this is something that we see, that if your focus is not on God, if we don't focus on God, and we're focused on the me of life, and we're wronged, and we start to hate, or we start to grow bitter, our bitterness just grows, it consumes us, and we see this in Haman. It consumes his entire life. Every time he sees Mordecai, he just becomes more and more enraged against this man. So he finds out that Mordecai's a Jew, and he devises a plan, and he goes to the king, and he says, hey, king, he kind of tricks the king into this plan. He says, king, look, there is a certain people in this land, and in your kingdom, they don't have the same customs as us. And they don't obey some of your laws. Okay? Hey, listen, they're not obeying. Here's what I think we should do. I think we should exterminate them. Let me exterminate them, and I'll give you 10,000 talents of silver to put in your treasury. And of course, the king, hearing that people aren't obeying his law, says, keep your money, keep their money, and do it. So he gives them the ring to make the edict. So the edict is made to exterminate the Jews, genocide. The thing about making a law like that, when you make an edict as a Persian king, you can't rescind it. There's no rescinding that law. So we see in chapter 4, Mordecai mourns over this. He hears about the edict. He's at the gate, right? So he hears about it, and he starts to mourn. What does he do? He wears sackcloth. And he's at the king's gate wearing sackcloth, which is kind of an insult to the king. So, but he's trying to draw attention to the fact that this is an injustice. And it's reported to Esther. And Esther sends him clothes. She doesn't know what's going on. She sends him clothes and says, hey, dude, you can't wear sackcloth at the king's gate. And they start messaging each other. Okay, now, not direct messages. They're not DMing each other. They're using people like the old school. They use people to send messages back and forth. And she says, he's telling her, look, Esther, there's this edict that we're going to be destroyed. And as a side note, Haman says, when should we do this? They cast a lot. This was like in the first month of the year. They cast a lot and it came up in the 12th month. That's the pure. Pure is or pur, however you pronounce it, is a lot. And we'll get to what that means later. And it came up in the 12th month. So they had probably a little less than a year to get this resolved. But God had to get it resolved. So he's telling her, Esther, you need to go to the king. You need to go to the king and talk to him. So she sends a message back. Mordecai, I'm sure you know, anybody who walks into the presence of the king without being requested is to be killed. That is the law. That is the law unless he raises his scepter. Basically saying, I don't know that I want to do this. And then in chapter 4, starting verse 12, Mordecai says, so when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this message. Do not think, and this is the pivotal part of the story, that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for all the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Speaking of the providence of God. And this is where we see this is about God. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. And this is where it is that thought is even expanded more. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish this young lady. Just said, if I die, I die. She was ready to die for the cause of God, for her belief. Well, secondary story here. This kind of leaves you hanging here and there. So that's kind of the cliffhanger. So they do that. They fast forward, and we have to know that along with what comes along with fasting, if not prayer. So in chapter 5, she goes to meet the king. And he doesn't kill her. He still thinks she's the best. He doesn't kill her. Raises a scepter. She goes up and touches it, because I guess that was the tradition. Thank you for not killing me. And he says he's so glad to see her. He loves her so much, in whatever depth of that really means. He's like, Esther, good to see you. What do you want? I'll give you anything, up to half the kingdom. What do you want? And she says, I want to have a banquet with you and Haman. And he says, done. Haman, come on, let's go. He does, like right now. Let's go to this banquet. And they go to this banquet. And, Esther's there in the banquet. And again, the king says, all right, what do you want? Tell me what you want. Up to half the kingdom. And she says, I don't know why she did this. Is she buying time? She says, another banquet tomorrow, and then I'll tell you. And he says, all right. And bring Haman. Okay. So they're done with the banquet. Haman is leaving. And he sees Mordecai again. And this is that consumption of hatred that, again, is depicted from a person who has no godly influence in his life, no real godly influence. And he's just so full of rage. And he goes home and he's talking to his wife and he goes, every time I see that guy, every time, I have all this good stuff, I can't be happy. I can't be happy because I hate him so much. And his friends are there, they come and they say, just kill him. What? Who is this guy? He's a nobody. Just kill him. Yeah, that's what I'll do. Oh, come on. So he has a gallows man, which is basically, we think of gallows as something you hang by the rope. In those days, they would hang you, but they would impale you on the end of a stick, so that your body would be out there to see with the big thing sticking through it. And so that's what he does. He has this scaffold thing made so they can hang his body some 75 feet up in the air, and that's the plan. And It says in verse 9, Haman went out happy that day in high spirits. When he saw Mordecai, he was very angry. Verse 9. And then in verse 6, I call this the sleepless epiphany. Because the king, and this goes back, okay, this goes back to chapter 2. The king can't sleep. And they don't have Netflix, so he needs to figure out how he's going to fall asleep. So he says, bring the Chronicles and read me the stuff from the Chronicles. This is basically the diary of everything that happens. He says, and he's listening to this, and he's read that this man named Mordecai uncovered a plot against the king and saved the king's life. And the king says, who is this guy at? What have we done for him? Oh, well, we haven't done anything. And he says, is there anybody here in the court? Yes, Haman's here. Bring him. Haman comes in. He says, Haman, what would you do for a man who the king would glorify? And Haman's going, oh, that's me. The king wants to honor me. Well, let me tell you, king, here's what you do. You get a robe, you put it on some guy, and you get your own robe, and you put it on the guy you're going to honor, and you put him on your horse that you've ridden with your crest on it, and the guy he's going to walk this horse around town, like the town crier. This is what the king does for who he honors. This is what the king does for who he honors. Yeah. The king says, okay. Go do that for Mordecai. And I would imagine that there was probably a great rush of adrenaline reflex for Mordecai at that moment. Because he knew what was going on. Because he's told that later. He's told, this thing, how are you going to resist this? People start realizing there's something going on here. So he does that. He has to do that. And it says in verse 14, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet. So Haman was talking about what a terrible thing he just had to do with lifting up Mordecai. And immediately he goes to the banquet. Verse 1 of chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and they were drinking wine on the second day. It's a long banquet. The king asked again, Queen Esther, what is your petition? If it will be given you, what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. And Queen Esther answered, if you have found favor, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request, for I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes and Queen Esther asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up and rage, left his wine, he went, which was unusual, and went into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to the height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house." He had set it up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. And that's as much as I'm going to read. And that's enough to see the providence of God. This is what so many things that we see in the scriptures, like Joseph, that the providence of God is working. And the takeaway, I think, for Christians is that we are purpose for God's work. We are part of God's kingdom. We talked about that this morning. The kingdom is here today. And what we find is there's a refinement of motivation and focus. That our motivation is based on what God wants. And our focus is simply on God. If I was to explain the Bible, that would be it. There's nothing more than that. Our motivation is to be what God wants us to do, because our focus is always on God. Is that not the Christian paradigm? Is that not what the Christ died for? Did not God hang himself on the cross so that we would come to that knowledge? I think that's what it is. And that's all I have. That's the lesson this morning. Thank you for listening. If you're a Christian this morning and you need to reconcile your life with God, this is a good time to do it. If you're not a Christian, this is a good time to profess the name of Christ and be baptized. I think there's water in it. If there isn't, we'll find some. There's an ocean there if we have to. We won't delay. Whatever your need may be, come forward as we stand.